Welcome to a CAPS event, the Cultural Awareness Programs event. I believe this is the third one this semester. My name is June Gillum, and I'm an English teacher here at Delta. I'm going to be presenting the final CAPS event on April 21st in Cunningham Lounge. You should have gotten a flyer at the door promoting this event. It will be in Cunningham Lounge, and it will be in a workshop setting, so people will sit in a circle, and then there will be a little audience section also. And this is for any people who have experienced struggles in their lives. There will be some stories about struggles in the book that the presenter wrote, and then she will explain some tools to use to transform the struggles in people's lives into sort of like a happy ending. So that's what the title means, the sweetness of the struggles. So there will be tools presented. So it's an interactive workshop on April 21st. So happy St. Patrick's Day. Thank you for coming to this event. And I'd like to introduce next Cynthia Gatlin, who is a founding member of the Cultural Awareness Programs Committee at Delta, and she will introduce the presenter today. So here's Cynthia Gatlin.
Good morning, and thank you for coming today. As the co-chair of the CAP committee, I'd like to thank all of you for coming to our program today, Slaves in San Joaquin County. Our presenter today is Grant Ashley, a local historian who specializes in race and the rich and colorful history of our region. Grant has a BA in history and is continuing his research in advanced history. I'm also very proud to say that Grant is an alumnus of San Joaquin Delta College. Grant told me that when he attended Delta College, he enrolled in every history course the college had to offer. And he's fondly remembered to this day by one of our favorite history instructors and a fellow CAP member, Nelson Nagai. Last year, Grant came and did a CAP program for us entitled Black Pioneers of Stockton, and actually today's program is a continuation of that program. It's part 2. So after today's program, we're going to have a reception, and we're going to hold our question and answer period to the reception, which is going to be in the Horton Gallery, Shima 144. And he has a wealth of information, so I do encourage you to come out and talk to him. And so now I'd like to present our own local historian, Mr. Grant Lewis Ashley. Grant, thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thanks everyone for showing up today. Hopefully this will prove to be a fruitful presentation. Now, this presentation will not be the sanitized, romanticized reporting on slavery that we usually encounter in high school and some college courses. Therefore, I'll have to relate you with some of the inhumanities that slaves experienced, not only in the Stockton area, but throughout the states. Peter Singer, the controversial moralist, philosopher, and ethicist, explains brilliantly, I believe, how slaves were treated on the same basis as animals. Although Singer employs the use of the philosophical paradigm and polysyllabic terms, I will try to explain Singer's relationship as simple as possible. On a basic scale, white slave owners did not take the interests of their slaves seriously. To disconnect slaves from the human race and conclude that since they're not members of our species, they felt they were entitled to exploit them. Just the same as animals are exploited. We hunt them for sport. We use them for experiments. We ride them in rodeos. We hold them in zoos. And we use them as food. Moreover, slave owners typically did not accept that pain matters as much as when felt by Africans, for example, as when felt by Europeans. Speciesists, as Singer explains, gave greater weight to the interests of members of their own species when there was a clash between those interests, other than the interests of the other species. Having said that, perhaps we can understand why slaves were beaten, raped, skinned, boiled, beheaded, and bred. Now, I want you to stay abreast with these things as we go along, and bear in mind that these weren't people that woke up in the morning and performed a job that they didn't really want to, that was a difficult job, toiled at their labor, went back to sleep and repeated the same cycle. I want you to bear in mind Singer's relationship. Furthermore, being that they were of a different species and their feelings weren't considered, that helped construct the ideology of slavery. And to care for their feelings would collapse the whole system of slavery. So we have to bear in mind how slaves were treated at various times in a typical manner. Now, this is 1849 Auburn, California. Sorry. This gives an example of the blacks that filled capacities in California. A large number of blacks that came here were freed, enslaved, and escaped. And they filled many capacities. Not to embrace the much promoted capacity that they were brought here from their slave owners and worked the gold mines. There were washerwomen, expressmen, barbers, civil rights activists, teachers, the things of that ilk. We're going to get in touch with the climate and the atmosphere of the slave era California before we begin. This is a illustration of the minstrels that came through Stockton during the gold rush era. This is around about 1855. Stockton not only was a supply center to the southern mines, it was also a center for entertainment and activity. And there were quite a few black minstrels that came through, and they would sing and dance and tell funny stories and things of that ilk at the much popular Corinthian Theater here in Stockton. Now, some of the upward mobility that was going on at that time was the first state convention of colored citizens of California. It was in 1855. There were 4 conventions held, one in 1855, 1856, 1857, and 1865. All the dignitary and important black men of California got together, and the first convention, what was on the main agenda was not only the upward mobility for blacks, but also the Negro testimony law that professed that any black in California could not serve as a witness against a white in any situation in court proceedings. A law that came out 1852, because what that meant, if your wife was raped, beaten, or killed, you couldn't testify in court. So you can very well put yourself in a position that your whole family was killed out, but you could not testify in court. Now, in all honesty and fairness, some of the whites sidestepped this because there were instances that blacks were treated very, very brutally or murdered or things of that ilk, and whites stepped forward and took things in their own hands. But this was a very defeating bill that came out in 1852, and that was on their agenda there. This is the Reverend Jeremiah King, founder of Second Baptist Church of Stockton. King was an ex-slave. Something's wrong with the presentation here. King was an ex-slave, and he was a landowner and a farmer. And he began the Second Baptist, a spinoff of the First Baptist Church here. He represented Stockton in the first colored convention of California. He represented not only Stockton, but San Joaquin County. This shows upward mobility of blacks shortly after something's not working right. After slavery. This is around, shortly before slavery. It's around 1860. This gentleman in the back here, William Lee, he was an honorary member of Eureka Engine Company. And he's buried today in the Pioneer Fireman's Plot at the Stockton Rural Cemetery. Now, this photograph here is touted as the first Christian church in California. It's the First Presbyterian Church. And the noteworthy thing about the First Presbyterian Church, among other things, well, it was built in 1850. Black Baptists in 1859, who sold it to the Japanese residents in 1909, and unfortunately burned down in 1939. But nevertheless, the white congregation of the First Presbyterian Church held a conference in St. Louis, and they announced the sinfulness of the system of slavery. It's around about 1855, and they made a profession that all Christians should denounce the slavery and release their slaves. So it kind of tells their ideology at that time, and perhaps some of the blacks were fortunate enough to have a church of that ilk in Stockton. This is the Central Methodist Church. It was organized in 1849. I believe it was demolished in 1859. But nevertheless, they embraced blacks in large degree. And it was in 1855 that the White Methodist Church here in Stockton resolved that we respectfully request the General Conference to take into consideration the propriety of so revising the chapter on slavery as to require slaveholders to emancipate their slaves. So that was their ideology here in Stockton also. This is the 1852 census, and it demonstrates the Truckee Native Americans that are indicated as laborers. But they were more than likely, from my research, slaves. And they were slaves in the sense that they were not free to leave, and they worked at free labor. Until 1867, an estimated 10,000 Native Americans, including 4,000 children, were enslaved as chattel, that is movable property. Whether the masters were Catholics or Protestants or priests, they regarded the Native Americans as instruments of their own will or instruments of God's will, and was to be put to their use as soon as possible. As early as 1839, Johann August Sutter, who we know as John Sutter, the founder of Sutter's Mill outside of Sacramento, held more than 300 slaves and Native Americans in captivity, 300 to 800 by estimates. They were in a complete state of slavery. And one account told of seeing them fed from troughs in the hot sun. Though not proven, it was also claimed that John Sutter had sexual relations with Native girls as young as 10. Now, this is not proven, but what is proven and what is accepted, he did rely on Native American women for his sexual desires. Now, these are imprisoned Native Americans that were after the period of slavery, but for illustrative purposes, and photos are hard to come by of actual enslaved Native Americans. I'll use this for an illustrative purpose. These are Modocs that 60 of them had held off about 600 soldiers here in California. And although many whites isolated in the mining and ranching areas wanted nothing to do with the Native Americans, others saw them as slaves. To obtain Native American for use as slaves, they simply kidnapped them, especially children. A large amount of children kidnapped. And the newspapers, the archival research demonstrates there were several instances where children were just taken. They were just kidnapped. from the certain tribes. And I'll give you an example of some. 1854, these are all news accounts. Kidnapping children in Sacramento. 1858, enslaving children for San Francisco. 1861, enslaving children after U.S. Army raids village. This is Humboldt and Minnesota counties. 1861, white settlers in Sierra kidnapped Modoc children and women. That was in Nevada County. And in 1861, killing adults to get children. This happened on a grand scale. Now, if the kidnapping didn't prove to be fruitful, it was a very difficult thing to do, the United States government in 1850, through legislation, enacted a law, and the law read in part. It was called the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. But the law read in part, in no case shall a white man be convicted on any offense upon the testimony of an Indian. So that put them in the same category as the blacks. You could not testify in court. Rape, have all the fun you can, do all the killing. If there's not a white that witnessed the act, there was no act. And sometimes this backfired against the whites because Native Americans were witnesses to very touchy cases. And there are cases that they use the testimony of Native Americans. But for the most part, the Native Americans and people of African descent, you couldn't testify. Whites should be able to obtain control of the children. And this really opened the ideology of slavery. Any child you want, you have a right to that child. And you have to look at the ideology of that time because it kind of went back to what some people might call the mindset of the dominant culture at that time. And the mindset of dominant culture, I'll explain to you through the commonly, some of the common people that we know. And one of the persons was Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. Mark Twain had that ideology, and I'm not talking about the Huckleberry Finn and the Tom Sawyer. Mark Twain writes in some of his letters in the archives as a young boy at 1845, I believe. As a young boy of 13 years old, he worked for the Hannibal Press. And in that setting was a young slave girl, mulatto, as he explained her. Mark Twain's friend would have his sexual liberties with this girl every day. He was raping her. He raped her. And she would cry out in horror, and she would cry out in distress. And her mother would also cry out in distress. But she couldn't do nothing, of course, because she could be killed or beaten or so forth and so on. Mark Twain wrote, now we're getting into the ideology of some of the mindset at that time, and I'm not attempting to reduce anyone or alienate you from anyone. But Mark Twain wrote, he found it killingly funny that his friend would rape this girl, and she would cry out in distress from being raped, and her mother would cry out in distress. And Mark Twain further stated that it was a white man's right to have sex with the Africans anytime they wanted to. So I'm trying to get you abreast of how these groups of people at this time, how unimportant their lives were. And Mark Twain was a very interesting character because he not only used the derogatory term nigger in the sense of his books, he used it very freely. And that wasn't a reduction to the people of that time. And it wasn't what a lot of historians would call presentism. This was present to that time. These people somehow were morally disconnected or morally unknowing. Because you can use that argument for almost any misdeed or any misstep through history. Mark Twain would speak of the niggers in a derogatory term as far as when he became ambassador to the Sandwich Islands out of San Francisco, Hawaiian Islands. He wrote back when he first saw the natives that it looked like a big herd of niggers. And he also, when they changed the Lake Tahoe from the European name to the Native American name, he said it sounded like some nigger. And also, we have to get into the ideology of Mark Twain and of a lot of Americans at that time. Also, Mark Twain would state that you can tell when it was going to rain because he would look at the big, fat, greasy nigger. So, and some things on another another way, but we have to kind of get in the mindset. But as the Native American slaves, any Indian convicted of a crime and any white person could come to court, pay the Indians fine, and use them for services, slave services, for 4 months. This was legislative law. Any Indian strolling, loitering in the vicinity where alcohol was sold could be taken to court, a warrant would be taken out within 24 hours. The service of that Indian in question would be sold to the highest bidder. And the term of service would not exceed 4 months. This includes women also. Wink, wink. In 1860, the law was amended to state that Native Americans, or any vagrant Native American, could be put under the custody of whites for the purpose of employment and training. Under that law, it was possible to retain the service of a Native until 40 years of age. Get them at 13, you can keep it until 40 years of age. For women, it was reduced to 35 years of age. So we have to come to kind of in the mindset of how these people lived at that time. Now, the laws were so subjugating and oppressive and exploitative that many natives professed to be blacks or Mexicans to avoid being captured. Now, this is Charles Maria Weber, founder of Stockton. So Captain Charles Weber appears to have embraced the efforts of blacks. He donated the land for the Elk Street Black School. He donated the land for the Second Baptist Church and for the AME Church. But Weber also employed the same slave techniques as Sutter had on his ranch here in Stockton, and he used hundreds of Native Americans, as is reported, to mine ore. And the Native American leader, Jose Jesus, was a supplier of the Native Americans. He would supply the Native Americans, and in turn, Charles Weber would supply him with goods. Now, this was a lucrative deal for the Native Americans because if you didn't go along with the system, they were going to kidnap them and take them anyway. So sometimes it was better to kind of get it into a structured setting. Now, unbeknownst to me, the illustrations changed. But it was next. These are Native American females. Of all the forms of slavery and oppression, they were the most brutalized. They were examples of how the dominant culture could enforce the supreme power of authority. Native American women and children were kept as house servants and sex servants. A girl considered suitable for a servant would bring up to $200. That was a lot of money during the mid-19th century. And the abuse of Native Americans was so intense that the Stockton newspaper had a complaint in 1854. It was called the Squaw Protection Bill. And what they were saying, any white found having improper sexual relations with the Native Americans will be highly fined and perhaps jailed. And this bill was introduced in legislature in, as I said, 1855. It didn't reduce to a great degree the white settlers taking the women from their tribes. You have to bear in mind there were a lot of unattached men at that time. It's not an excuse, it's an explanation. But there were a lot of unattached men, and if they wanted sex, they just took it. They took it from the Native American women. I don't know if they took it from Native American men. They took it from the Native American women, and of course since there wasn't testimony in court from Native American women or Native American men, African American women, they kind of had free reign. Now, this is a 1852 census of the McGee family here in Stockton. You can see McGee was a farmer. And below, there's his slave chattel. And Serena, Hannah, F.A. Susan, so forth and so on. These people were held in slavery. In 1852, there were about, from my research, my ongoing research, there were about 60 slaves in Stockton and some on the outskirts of the vicinity. Although the 1849 California Constitution denied slavery, they denied it with a wink. Slavery was allowed, of course, because we had the slaves here. And we were professed as the free state, but that did not apply. This census here also proves the much promoted ideology that slaves were brought here to work the gold mines and so forth and so on. Of course, there were slaves brought here to work the gold mine, and a lot of them were offered their freedom if you worked so many years, or they were hired out and so forth and so on. Sometimes it happened, sometimes it did happen, sometimes it didn't. They turned back on them. This is a great illustration of a slave family here in Stockton, and I want you to bear in mind the ideology that I tried to embrace you with the atmosphere and the climate of a slave. Now, I use this photograph. This is a post-Civil War photograph, and of course there aren't any photographs that I've ran across that demonstrates slaves in San Joaquin County, slaves in Stockton, but I use this as my illustrator. Especially the symbolism and the emotional that's attached to it. Now, these are not only slaves of centuries past, these represent slaves after the Civil War also. And the owners, there are quite a few owners, a lot of owners in Stockton. Quite a few were attorneys. There was one judge that was a slave owner. And there were the Walthals, the Fairbanks, the Kellys, the Douglases, the Barnetts, the McLeans, the Creeners, and a lot of others in Stockton that were slave owners. And one good thing about the 1852 census, of course, when they did the 1850 census, it was so disorganized and so disconnected that they did another census in 1852. The 1850 census doesn't list the slaves, so convoluted and confused. One of the good things about the 1852 census, they do list the slaves and the servants. Now, this is another example of slaves in San Joaquin County, the Walthals. There's Edmund, Martha, Alfred. They were slaves of Madison Walthall. Now, Madison Walthall was a keeper of customs at the Port of Stockton here. He was also a founding trustee of the First Baptist Church here in Stockton. They were members of the First Baptist Church, Madison Walthall's slaves. It's kind of ironic, a slave going to church, but nevertheless, they were members of Madison. They were listed among the 21 pioneer members of the First Baptist Church. Now, while he was a custom keeper at the port, the 7-year-old Alfred fell off into the water, off the wharf. And one of Walthall's good friends, Mr. Campbell of the Lexington Hotel, jumped in the water and saved him, the little slave boy Alfred. And that was a newsworthy account that was included in the local newspapers. Now, this is a rewrite of the Emancipation Papers here in Stockton, the original Emancipation Papers of the Walthals freeing their 3 slaves. It was very difficult to read on the original form. This is another form that's scripted. But I will read you in part what the Emancipation Papers 1852 professed. Edward A. Sambo, now Sambo was a derogatory term of a happy-go-lucky slave during that era. Nevertheless, Edward A. Sambo and Martha, listed as slave property of Elizabeth Walthall, they apparently made an agreement that when we come from Mississippi and you get to California, if you earn enough money and you work and so forth and so on, we'll free you. Evidently that was made. The document is still being researched. Made an agreement that they would be released in June 1854. And on that date, $485.95 was paid, and both Edward and Martha were released and emancipated from slavery. In addition, Elizabeth Walthall that was the actual owner of the slaves, Madison Walthall's wife, sold their son to them at a bargain price for $150 and forever emancipated him. Now, this is the second end of the document. And what the document has is a lot of legal terms and legal safeguards professing that they cannot be taken into slavery. Furthermore, and my family will not have claims against these slaves, nor will these slaves have claims against my family. Some slaves here sued their past owners. Some were successful, very few, and some were not, but she gave the safeguard there. Okay, this is Campbell and Walthall. Campbell later became a lawyer, as it's demonstrated here. Walthall later became a lawyer, as is demonstrated here, and this is kind of a noteworthy item here. The Campbell in this illustration here was a Campbell who jumped in and saved Walthall's child, his slave boy, 6-year-old slave boy. Now, we're going to focus on Henry Crabb. It's a very interesting item here. Now, as I stated earlier, there was not a law that supported slavery in California. Henry Crabb sidestepped the continuity of that ideology. In 1852, Henry Crabb, a Stockton assemblyman, introduced the Fugitive Slave Act and the Negro Evidence Law. And that was the law that a Negro, a black, could not testify in court under any circumstances, other than against another black or a person of color. The law was introduced, it was passed by legislation and signed by Governor Bigler, which was a pro-slavery man himself. And of course, it prevented black from testifying in court. And what it did, it really horribly frightened the blacks of California, because any slave could be taken back into slavery, or even if you weren't a slave. All you had to do was grab the slave, go to court, take out an order, and you could take them into custody. And being that most of the men at the courthouse here were pro-slavery, a lot of blacks were shaking in their boots. And it caused a lot of blacks here, through my research and evidence searching, to change their names and give a little twist on their names, and I'll demonstrate that in the future. Now, this is an exciting story of an escape of a slave here in Stockton. And I'll try to condense it as much as possible. There's different versions on this, and I'm still trying to get things in the right perspective. Nevertheless, an ex-slave named Stephen Hill of Tuolumne County was successful enough to accumulate $4,000 worth of property, and that's a tremendous amount of money during the early 1850s. Well, Hill was enslaved by, enslaved by slave catchers. Came back from the South, and his owner from the South claimed he owed him money, so forth and so on. And he was taken to Stockton and put aboard the ship Urilla. And he was to be taken back to the South. Well, he was very popular in his community. And some of his friends came up from Tuolumne County, and they went into the St. Charles Hotel here downtown. Hill was on the steamer. The slave catcher was in the St. Charles Hotel, and they plied him with alcohol and got him drunk. And they got him drunk, and they went to the ship, and they released Hill. And Hill was a freed man. And he lived to be a ripe old age, although he was never as financially fruitful as he had been in the beginning. But there is an actual case of a slave escaping. Now, this is the St. Charles Hotel where the slave catcher stayed. And the reason I'm illustrating this is it's going to play in a role of another escape. And the Angelo Oliva is going to be one of the primary players there. So I'm just kind of demonstrating a little connection here with the St. Charles Hotel. And it was a pretty luxurious hotel at that time, all the accommodations and so forth and so on. St. Charles being a very common name at that time. It wasn't named after anyone, but a lot of hotels were named as St. Charles. Okay, this is another Stockton attorney, Bain and Bolden. He became a judge later. Judge A.C. Bain presided over a case in early Stockton. It was against a free man in the 1850s, whereas a white person was arrested for assaulting the black man. He was a free black man. Bain's ruling read in part, and this will kind of keep you in brace so we don't kind of get off track or become far afield of the situation of blacks at that time. The lawyer stated, "The Negro's position I hold to be this. He is in a sort of state of wardship relatively towards the white man, and neither his social life nor his legal position is an equal with the white race." That's kind of ironic because years later, the Dred Scott decision that was a springboard for the Civil War professed the same thing. You're nowhere close to a white man. Nowhere. And this demonstrates the uphill battle and the barriers and blockades that blacks experienced, the free blacks, when they tried to seek redress through the courts. Now this is Judge S.A. Booker, Samuel A. Booker. There was another incident involving him. He became a judge in San Joaquin County, 1850s. And the story goes, he encountered a darky, blacks were called that at that time, on the street who had neglected to take his hat off in the presence of the judge. It's a Southern judge, ex-Southern judge. So he lifted his cane up to strike him. He was going to strike him and beat him. How dare you not have respect for a white man? Well, the black gentleman eventually took his hat off, and it sent a message to the rest of the blacks, free blacks in Stockton. Whenever they encountered Judge Bain, make sure you take your hat off to avoid the beating, to avoid the cane. This is another attorney, Deputy District Attorney of Stockton, early 1850s through the 1860s. He kind of embraced the ideology of blacks. He helped assist a slave girl who we will touch on later, who was released from slavery after slavery had ended. And this is the original San Joaquin County Courthouse. It's built in 1850. This was a vehicle, especially towards the end of slavery and after slavery, for releasing slaves during that era. It was embracive to the people of color. Now this serves an interesting story here. It's a long drawn out story, so I'm going to try to condense it as much as possible. This is James advertisement in the Old Stockton Directory of James E. Kidd. He was a Stockton painter, white Stockton painter and sign maker, and he played a pivotal role in the releasing of a slave. Kidd was a Southern man who opposed slavery. Now there was a slave named Charlie Bates of Stockton who was brought to California from Georgia. Kidd was said to have lived across the plantation from Charlie Bates, and he knew Charlie Bates. He had known Charlie Bates. Bates' master had promised him freedom. Come to California, work for a while, work the fields, the mines, so forth and so on, and I'll free you. But he was tricking him back into slavery by telling him, before we cement our deal, do you want to go back south and visit your parents? Visit your wife, I'm sorry, not your parents, your wife and your family. And Charlie Bates was on his way back to Georgia, and he was in Panama. That was a cutoff point, so-called shortcut for getting back south. Well, he ran into James Kidd, and when he told James Kidd the story there in Panama, James Kidd was on his way back to Stockton. James Kidd told him, Charlie, they're going to take you back into slavery. Do not go back there, they're taking you back, come back to Stockton with me. So Bates, he comes back to Stockton with James Kidd, and after he gains employment, he's doing well, saves up $200, but in the meantime, Bates' master sends a slave catcher from the south to retain Bates. And he ran into Bates on a Stockton street, took him into custody, took him to the courthouse, had a writ of habeas corpus written out, and he took him and put him up for auction. Well, James Kidd played a very important role because he got some of Charlie's friends together who enjoyed him and liked his company to gather some monies and help pay for the auction of this slave here. Well, the slave owner wanted around about $1,000. This is where Angelo Olivia comes in. He was the one who had enough monies to buy Charlie Bates out of slavery. And the owner was very, very angry when he found out he was bought and set free. Well, he wasn't free to the degree because he had to pay Angelo back his monies. But nonetheless, they tricked the slave catcher into selling him for a very low amount, and he was set free. So that was a case of an auction and a slave set free. Now, this distinguished gentleman here is Jeremiah Burke Sanderson. Now, there's not enough time to give you all of his credentials and how noteworthy he was in the history of Stockton. The computer's a little out of whack. But nevertheless, among many things, he was a preacher and a civil rights leader and a teacher. And he was one of the featured speakers at the California State Convention for Colored Citizens. Nevertheless, while serving as a school teacher at the Elk Street Black School here in Stockton, he received word from the students that there was a slave girl held in captivity long after the Civil War, 1872. Of course, the Civil War ended in 1865. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves, and so forth and so on. Well, in 1872, he was informed by his colored students here that there's a girl held on a ranch on Mariposa Road here, and slavery, a 16-year-old girl. So J.B. Sanderson went out and sought Sheriff Cunningham, Thomas Cunningham. The Cunningham building here on campus is named after. And they rode out to the ranch. They had a talk with the gentleman, Shabal Durham. And they went back and forth and so forth and so on. There's different versions. But nonetheless, they obtained the slave girl and brought her before the judge. Now, it was a long, drawn-out trial, and it only lasted one day, but nonetheless, this is what Judge S.A. Booker's parting words were. Annie Richards, you are at liberty to go where you please. The judge then left the bench, and the Negroes in posse crowded around the girl. Shabal didn't want to let her go at that time, but they crowded around the girl, and a lively and fierce war of words ensued among the whites and the black. At that time, a black gentleman got on one side and a black lady got on the other side, and they surrounded her. And as they walked out the courts, the Negroes of that era triumphantly cheered. There was a great cheer. And they escorted her out of the court, and they took her to J.B. Sanderson's house, and she lived to be a ripe age also. Now, this is Sheriff Thomas Cunningham. He was a very fair man to the people of color, and he meted out his punishments in a balanced way. And I have to read a portion of what J.B. Sanderson wrote in his diary in 1872. Dismissed school at 9 o'clock, went to Mr. Dunham's ranch with Sheriff T. Cunningham, Thomas Cunningham, after Annie Richards. I interviewed Mr. Dunham, rode into town with Annie Richards, called upon Mr. Dunham, took dinner at Cunningham's, attended court before Judge Booker, Annie Richards released at my house, attended meeting, very enthusiastic meeting. So this was a girl that was held in this captivity after slavery. And what they professed at the courthouse, there were other slaves in California that they knew were held in captivity as much as 7 years after the Civil War. And they professed, we're going to go down there and get them too, especially in the Alabama settlement, what we would call today the Merced, Madeira area. There were a lot of slaves in what they termed the Alabama settlement. Now, I'm going to demonstrate upward mobility after slavery for blacks in San Joaquin County. Unfortunately, Native Americans at that time were just as much slaves as blacks. There were more Native Americans, were invisible in the records, and it's going to require me more research in the future to include them as I should. This is William Robinson. He was a stage express rider, Pony Express. Took the same oath as the Pony Express riders. Very embraced man in the black community. He brought himself out of slavery. He was freed from slavery. So you can imagine his mindset when the Fugitive Slave Act of 1852 was enacted. He represented at the California State Convention also. At one time he represented Stockton. This demonstrates the black capacity in Stockton during 1876. This is a celebration, not a centennial, but a 4th of July celebration, and you can see the blacks in the background there. 1876, to kind of give you a gauge, it's the same year that Sitting Bull had the skirmish with Custer. This is the AME Church. These are members of the AME Church here in Stockton. Around late 1880s, early 1890s. The church was established in 1854. So these are some of the members here during that time. This gentleman here was an ex-slave also. That's Henry Hall. He was a very successful man in the black community at that time. He's in the pioneer. He's the only black included in the pioneer list here in Stockton Pioneers. This is his family. His son, Herbert Hall, graduated from grammar school, and they wouldn't let him into the high school here because they had a law against the blacks going to the high school here. So there was a law that was enacted at that time that if you couldn't supply a high school for the blacks here, you would have to send them to a high school somewhere that would accept them. So they had to send them to San Francisco, and it cost the cities a lot of money. So it only happened once. After then, they allowed people, blacks, to attend the high schools. Unfortunately, during my research, I don't find neither Hispanics or Mexicans or Native Americans that are included in that school. Perhaps one of the reasons for Hispanics, St. George's had a large school, but I don't find too many of the Native Americans there. This is the Hart family, a pioneer family of Stockton. William Hart was a gold miner, and these are some of his children. Large family. Now, we believe this is the property that he had on Mariposa, on Park Lane, that exists today. The dwelling is still there. We believe that is the house he had there. They also had the house here at 47 West Sonora. This was built around about 1878, I believe, if my memory serves me correctly. And for a few bragging rights, as a child, I was privileged enough to live in the house for a while, kind of connected to the family through marriage. It's a beautiful, very large home with 6 bedrooms and 2 parlors and a big washroom and all things on the back, the wooden stove, things of that ilk. Unfortunately, it's not, doesn't exist anymore. This is William Hart's daughter, Helen Hart. And as a matter of fact, it's her son who constructed the PowerPoint for me. So the family still lives, and he's in the audience here today, part of the pioneer family. Now, she was very skilled in needlework, and some of her work was exhibited at the World's Fair. Now, I'm trying to go by memory. This is Daniel Dabney Gaines Hart. He was the first black to graduate from Stockton High School, 1917. This is an ex-slave, Moses Logan Rogers. He was an expert gold miner. There's too many volumes on him to speak of. Now he's down in the Mariposa area. It's quartz mining, gold mining. He bought himself out of slavery. He came here to Stockton around about the late 1880s. This is a photograph here of the Old Timers convention in the late 1880s. This is the home he built that still exists today in Stockton at 21 South San Joaquin Street. It's built in 1890. So if you ever drive by 21 South San Joaquin Street, take a view of the house. This is a plain citizen. She was a seamstress. There's not too much known about her, except she was a seamstress, Mrs. Elmore, and she worked for the Stockton glove and cloak factory. This is just the upward mobility through years. And this is one of the original Mac Daddies here from the, this is one of my favorite pictures. I mean, this guy is really sharp. He is sharp, and it shows. He was connected with the Hart family. Now, we really don't know what his connection was, but we know he was connected with the Hart family, and the research is ongoing. But I had to show this photograph. Long live the cool papas. Now, this is the Prince Hall Masons around 19 26. And it also shows further upward mobility in Stockton. This is a very distinguishing photograph, if you ask myself, very distinguished people here. This is Stockton 1924, up the street from the Stockton Hotel, Hotel Stockton, that had just been refurbished and renovated. Now, these are the Ku Klux Klan of Stockton. They did exist in Stockton. So it's kind of a reminder that some things do exist, or did exist at that time. It's kind of shocking to some people, but nevertheless, they did exist. And this is another march of the Ku Klux Klan, 1924 Stockton, in front of the refurbished, that's now refurbished, Hotel Stockton. And they were just a reminder. And it's kind of a spin-off. It's a reminder of slavery. It's a reminder of a struggle. When you see these people, it was about after the parade here. This was July 4th, 1924. They went on and marched to Oak Park that exists here in Stockton today, and they had a big speech that the newspaper account said there were over 1,000 people, and they had the free hot dogs and free rides for the kids, and they gave speeches and so forth and so on. But groups of this ilk that exist today are always a reminder of the struggle for people of color. Serve as a reminder to that degree. And through my presentation, I'm not to cause anyone resentment or disconnection or unequilibrium, and I'm not also here to have us all gather around the pond as it's over and join hands and sing "We Shall Overcome." That's not my goal. But I do have a goal when I give these presentations. I'm a continual history researcher, and my focus is race-based issues. And hopefully through presentations of this ilk, we can begin to connect with intent, consequences, design, and circumstances that are not always clear, things that we don't understand. And we can only make better sense of our community and the world which we live. My ongoing studies on the social construct of race will hopefully help researchers in the future and students understand my so-called famous words, why things are and how they came to be. And I thank you very much. I'm sorry if you...